the sealed door opens with a sound like a held breath finally released. Beyond it, warm air rises from stone. Shelves stretch wall to wall, lined with glass jars of seeds in every shade of amber, cream, and black. A spring murmurs somewhere beneath the floor. Martha stands at the threshold, lantern raised. Rose is already inside. 6 months earlier, Dry Creek buried 2 men in the same frozen week. The preacher said the Lord provides. The neighbors brought pies and said to be patient. Martha Hale listened to all of it, hands folded in her lap, and nodded the way a woman does when she is holding herself together by the seams. Then we provide for ourselves. Martha and Rose Hale were 30 minutes apart in age and a whole world apart in nature, though you would never know it from looking at them. Same dark hair, same gray eyes, same steady hands. Strangers mixed them up constantly, which Rose found amusing and Martha found mildly inconvenient. Martha was the kind of woman who measured twice before cutting once. She kept her pantry sorted by month and her accounts in a ledger with no erasures. She did not make promises she could not keep, and she did not start a thing she had not thought through. She had loved her husband, Edmund, quietly and practically, in the way of people who do not need to speak, a feeling out loud to mean it. Rose was different. She was the one who noticed when the light changed over the mountains, who pressed wildflowers into the backs of books, who asked questions at supper that made people set down their forks. She had loved her husband George loudly and without embarrassment, and she had not tried to hold back a single tear at his funeral. Now, they were both widows at 29, and Dry Creek had quietly made clear it did not know what to do with them. The town was kind at first. Then it was pitying. Then it began offering suggestions. A brother-in-law in Denver, a distant cousin in Missouri, a widow's position at the dry goods, sweeping and stocking, which would keep them comfortable enough if they were careful and did not take up much space. Martha declined everything with a closed mouth and a level gaze. Rose declined with a smile and an idea she had been turning over since February. She had heard about the Briar Ridge property from old Clem Aldridge at the feed store, who said it had stood empty for 11 years and that the county would let it go to anyone willing to pay the back taxes and not complain about the state of the roof. It needs work, Clem had warned. We need work, Rose had replied. Martha had thought about it for 4 days. Then she said yes. The wagon track up to Briar Ridge was barely a track at all by the time they reached it in early April. More suggestion than road, threading through spruce and loose shale until the house appeared around a long bend. Martha stopped the mule. It was worse than Clem had described. One porch post had given up entirely and leaned at an angle that suggested the porch shared its opinion. 2 windows were cracked. The chimney cap was missing. Frost-heaved boards ran along the south wall in a rippled wave, as if the house itself had flinched from something cold. Rose climbed down from the wagon seat and walked straight toward the front door. "It has good bones," she said. Martha sat a moment longer, looking at it. "It has bones," she agreed. The first night, they slept in their coats. The stove in the kitchen drew poorly and filled the room with thin smoke before Martha found a broken tile in the flue and plugged it with a strip of tin she cut from an old pail. After that, the fire caught properly, and they ate salt pork and cold biscuits by its light, while the wind pressed at the cracked windows with steady insistence. Rose was cheerful. She always was, in the way that Martha sometimes found exhausting and sometimes found necessary. "The bones are good," she said again, which was apparently going to become a theme. "The bones need a great deal of help," Martha said. "That is what bones are for." Martha looked at her over the pail lid they were using as a plate. "You are not going to stop saying that." "Not until it stops being true." In the days that followed, the debate between them was not loud. It never was. It ran underneath everything, in the glances exchanged when a new problem revealed itself: the warped cellar door, the collapsed section of fencing along the north field, the well that was good but needed its cover rebuilt before anything fell into it. Each discovery landed in one of two piles: the pile that meant we can manage this, and the pile that meant, should we have come here at all? Martha kept a list in her ledger. She was a woman who found comfort in lists, in the way that naming a thing made it smaller: cracked north window, warped cellar door, missing chimney cap, porch post, south wall boards. Each item was a decision to be made. Rose did not keep a list. She kept looking. She walked every room twice a day in those first 2 weeks. She ran her hands along walls, opened every cabinet, tested every floorboard with her boot heel. She said she was learning the house, which Martha understood to be Rose's way of saying she was deciding whether to love it. The answer, Martha suspected, was already yes. Her own answer came on the 8th morning, when she stood at the kitchen window before dawn and watched the light arrive over the ridge in a slow wash of gold and rose pink, and felt, for the first time since December, as if she was standing exactly where she was meant to be. She did not say this to Rose. Rose already knew. They began in earnest on a Monday. Martha took the stove, the flue, the windows, and the structural accounting of the porch. Rose took the interior rooms, the fencing plan, and the kitchen shelving, which had warped badly and needed to come down before new boards could go up. It was while Rose was pulling the last section of shelving away from the pantry wall that the back panel came loose with it, and she found herself looking at old wood and plaster that did not match anything else in the room. She put down her pry bar. She said, "Martha." Something in her voice made Martha come quickly. What the hidden passage gave them was more than a room. It gave them a shared direction neither had possessed since winter, something to move toward instead of away from. Martha had her lists, but lists are only useful when you know what you're working for. Rose had her hope, but hope needs something to attach itself to. Here was a thing to attach it to. They stood at the top of the stair together, not yet descended, and Martha reached sideways and took Rose's hand. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. The staircase was 8 steps, each one cut from the same gray stone as the walls, worn smooth at the center from old use. Martha went first with the lantern. Rose followed close enough that her breath was warm on Martha's shoulder. The chamber below was roughly circular, perhaps 20 feet across, with a ceiling that arched just high enough to stand under without ducking. The walls were fitted stone, dry and close-fitted, the work of someone who knew what they were doing. At the far end, water moved. It was not much. A trickle that emerged from a seam in the rock and ran along a narrow channel cut into the floor, disappearing into the opposite wall. But it was constant and it was warm, and it made the chamber feel a good 10 degrees warmer than the kitchen above. Neither sister spoke for a long moment. Then Martha lifted the lantern toward the shelves. They lined 3 full walls, floor almost to ceiling, built from pine planks that had aged to a deep amber, and on the shelves were jars, dozens of them, perhaps more, sealed with wax, each one labeled in a small, careful hand: mortgage lifter tomato, speckled cranberry bean, glass gem corn, purple Vienna kohlrabi, lazy wife pole bean, lemon queen sunflower. Labels continued in rows, beyond what the lantern could reach from where they stood. Rose moved to the nearest shelf and lifted a jar of bean seeds. She turned it slowly, watching the dark, speckled seeds shift inside. The wax seal was intact. The glass was perfectly clear. "How long have these been here?" she said softly. 11 years at least, Martha said. "If the house has stood empty since '77. She moved down the nearest shelf, reading labels. "Perhaps longer. Some of these varieties I have never seen written down." On the lowest shelf of the far wall, away from the seeds, they found the journals. There were 3 of them, thick and bound in brown calfskin, written in the same small, careful hand as the labels. Martha carried them upstairs to the kitchen table, while Rose went back twice for jars, just to look at them in better light. The journals belonged to a man named Aldous Crane. He had built the house in 1861, come west from Pennsylvania, with a wife named Harriet, and a plan that read, in his own words, as a life built on growing things in a place people said nothing would grow. The first journal was personal: the building of the house, the early failures of the garden, Harriet's notes in the margins correcting his spelling and adding her own observations about which plants took and which did not. The second journal was more technical. Crane had studied the spring beneath the house for years and had come to understand that its warmth was constant regardless of season. 54 degrees at all times, enough to keep the chamber frost-free through the hardest Colorado winter. He had drawn plans for what he called a glass growing room, a structure to be built above the south-facing slope, fed by warmth drawn up from the spring chamber through a system of clay pipes embedded in the floor. The third journal was unfinished. In it, Crane had begun writing instructions, step by step, careful, as if writing for someone who would come after him. The final entry was dated October 9th, 1877, and read, "The room is nearly ready. Harriet says we will plant the first beds by spring. I will finish these notes when—" It stopped there. Martha read it twice. Rose read it once, and then sat looking at the window for a while. "He meant for someone to find it," Rose said at last. "He meant for Harriet to find it," Martha said carefully. "But Harriet didn't." Rose turned back to the journal, smoothed the last page with her fingers. So, it waited. Martha looked at the jar of glass gem corn sitting on the table between them, seeds gleaming like polished stone. 11 years, she said. "Long enough," said Rose. They started with the chamber. Martha's approach was methodical. She spent the first full day doing nothing but measuring and recording the dimensions of the room, the temperature at the floor and the ceiling, the flow rate of the spring, the position of the channel. She filled 4 pages of her ledger with numbers and sketches before she was satisfied she understood what she was working with. Rose spent that same day in the journals, reading Crane's notes from the beginning, marking pages with strips of torn cloth. She read with a pencil in her hand, adding small annotations in the margins, questions mostly, and a few observations that built on what Crane had recorded. By evening, she had a list of her own, organized not by task, but by wonder. Things I did not know were possible. On the second day, they tested the seeds. Rose had read enough about seed keeping to know that age did not necessarily mean failure. She chose 12 jars representing different families: tomatoes, beans, corn, squash, brassicas, and planted a small sample from each in shallow dishes of soil set near the spring channel, where the warmth was most consistent. Martha built a rough plank shelf along the channel to hold the dishes level. They checked the dishes each morning before anything else. On the 6th day, the first shoots emerged. Pale green, tentative, barely visible. Rose called Martha to come and look, and Martha, who was not by nature a woman given to exclamation, said "oh" in a quiet voice and stood looking for some time. By the 10th day, 11 of the 12 varieties had germinated. 11-year-old seeds, Martha said more to herself than to Rose. Crane knew how to store them, Rose said. The temperature, the dark, the dry. He was careful. He was extraordinary, Martha said. Rose smiled at the word. Martha did not use it often. Building the glass growing room required more planning and more material than they had immediately at hand, so they began with what they could manage: clearing the south slope of the house, pulling volunteer scrub and old dead growth, leveling the ground. Crane's designs called for a foundation of fitted stone with clay pipe channels running beneath the floor, connected to the spring chamber through a short horizontal passage he had already excavated but never fully finished. Martha spent 3 full days clearing and extending that passage, working with a short-handled pick and a bucket, emerging each evening with her hair gray with stone dust and her back aching with a deep satisfaction she did not bother to explain. Rose worked above, sorting and cataloging the seeds, cross-referencing Crane's planting notes with his germination records, building a picture of what had succeeded in this particular mountain hollow and what had not. She was making a plan, not just a garden plan, a year plan, a full-season picture of what the room and the slope together could produce if everything went as hoped. She presented it to Martha one evening over supper, a hand-drawn map, carefully lettered, with planting dates and projected yields and a column of notes on each variety's special qualities. Martha studied it for a long time. "Where did you learn to do this?" she asked. "From Crane," Rose said simply. "He was a very good teacher." Martha turned the map over, looking at the south slope layout. "If the glass room works as designed—" "It will work," Rose said. "Crane tested the heat transfer for 4 winters before he built a single wall. The numbers are in the 2nd journal." Martha looked at her over the paper. "You are very certain," she said. "I am certain about the things Crane was certain about," Rose said. "He was not a man who guessed." Martha turned the map back over and looked at the planting calendar. Her finger traced the column for February, the dead of a mountain winter, when everything outside would be frozen and still. The column was full. She looked up at Rose. "Then we had better finish that passage," she said. The glass room went up in June. It took them 3 weeks. Every board of it measured and cut by Martha. Every pane of salvaged window glass set and sealed by Rose, who had a steadier hand for detail work. They built it low against the south wall, its pitched roof angled to catch the maximum light. Its floor crossed with the clay pipe channels Crane had laid out in his plans. The day they fired the first real heat through the pipes and felt warm air rise through the floor into a room glazed in afternoon sunlight. That day, they did not say much. They sat on the unfinished floor together and simply let it be real. It was a neighbor who first saw the glass glinting on the south slope. Hester Pruitt ran a homestead 3 miles down the ridge with her son Wally, who was 14 and inclined to wander. Wally had spotted the structure from a high point above the tree line while looking for a lost goat, and had come home with a description that made his mother set down her mending and look at him twice. "A whole glass room?" she said. "Big as a parlor," Wally said. "Maybe bigger." Hester Pruitt was a practical woman, not given to ill will, but she had lived long enough on Briar Ridge to know that strange things in the mountains needed accounting for. She rode up the following Saturday with a jar of preserves and a look on her face that was politely curious and more directly assessing. Rose met her at the door with coffee and showed her around without hesitation, which seemed to throw Hester briefly off her plan. Martha watched from the doorway as Rose walked their neighbor through the glass room. The clay pipe channels in the floor, the seeds already growing in the south-facing beds, the warmth that pressed at you like a gentle hand when you stepped inside even on a cool June morning. Hester Pruitt asked careful questions and received careful answers. She poked a finger into the soil of the nearest bed, felt the warmth at the roots, and was quiet for a moment. "This heat's from below," she said. "From the spring," Rose said. "It runs under the house, constant 54 degrees, summer and winter." Hester looked at her. "You're saying this room will grow through winter?" "That is what we're saying," Rose said pleasantly. What Hester said when she got back to town, Martha heard about it secondhand through Clem Aldridge, who heard it from the postmaster's wife, was not unkind exactly, but it had an edge of dismissal wrapped in a casing of concern. 2 women alone up there, building things they didn't know would hold. Getting ahead of themselves, probably. It was the kind of talk that started gently and had the potential to harden into something less gentle if it went unchecked. By the time it reached the Dry Creek Ladies' Auxiliary, which met on Thursdays at the Methodist Hall, it had acquired details Martha recognized as invented. They had spent foolishly on the glass, apparently. They had dug up the whole floor of the house, apparently. They were planning to sell produce in town, apparently, which was going to be a problem for Lars Gruber, who ran the summer market stall and had opinions about competition. Martha heard all of it on a supply run in late June and drove home in a silence that Rose read correctly the moment she saw her face. "What are they saying?" Rose asked. "That we have overreached," Martha said. Rose was quiet for a moment. Then, "Have we?" Martha thought about this honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about things. The structure was sound. The pipes held heat. The seeds had germinated at a rate Crane himself had not quite achieved in his notes. Perhaps the seeds had simply been stored even better than Crane knew. Or perhaps the spring ran a degree warmer than in his time. The accounts were tight, but not broken. There was no element of the plan she could examine and call a mistake. "No," she said. Rose nodded once, as if that settled it. "Then let them say it," she said. July was harder. Not because of the work. The work was steady and good. The beds in the glass room thickening into something real. The tomato seedlings already knee-high. The beans climbing the cane trellis Rose had built along the back wall. Not because of the house. The porch post was repaired, the windows reglazed, the south wall boards straightened and sealed against the coming autumn. It was harder because the loneliness found them, the way it does in quiet months when the hands are busy, but the evening is long. Martha had not expected this. She had thought that purpose would fill the space that grief had left, and it had, during the day. But in the evenings, when the work was done and they sat on the repaired porch and listened to the ridge settle into dark, the absence of their husbands was still there, quiet and heavy and real. She did not talk about it with Rose. She assumed Rose felt it too, and had decided, as Rose often did, to carry it by walking forward rather than standing still. She was wrong about the second part. One evening in mid-July, Rose sat down on the porch steps and did not pick up her mending or her book. She just sat there looking at the tree line. Martha sat beside her. After a while, Rose said, "Do you think we were right to come here?" Martha considered the question the way she considered all serious questions, which was to turn it over and look at all its sides before answering. "I think we are right to stay," she said at last. Rose turned to look at her. "That is not the same thing," she said. "No," Martha agreed, "but it is the part that matters now." Rose looked back at the tree line. The trouble with Lars Gruber came in the third week of July. He appeared on their track one morning without invitation, a large red-faced man in a good hat, and informed them in a voice intended to be helpful that the summer market had a process for new vendors, and that arriving with produce from nowhere and undercutting established sellers was not how things were done in Dry Creek. They had not offered to sell anything in Dry Creek yet. Martha told him so, calmly, without raising her voice. Gruber regrouped. He said that he had heard they were planning to, which amounted to the same thing, and that he wanted it understood early that the market had rules. He left the impression, without quite saying it, that he had friends on the county board, and that the back taxes on the Briar Ridge property were a fragile arrangement that could be reviewed if someone chose to take an interest. After he left, Rose said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "He is a frightened man." "He is an obstructive man," Martha said. "Both things," Rose said. "His stall is the only place people can buy vegetables in that town. He knows what we have here changes that." She looked at the glass room, warm and green in the morning light. "He is not wrong to be worried. He is just wrong about what to do about it." Martha looked at her. "What would you do about it?" Rose thought for a moment. "I would invite him to see it," she said. Martha studied her twin's face, the same face she saw in her own mirror, reading it the way you can only read a face you have known your whole life. "You have an idea," she said. "I have the beginning of one," Rose said. In the first week of August, the main spring pipe cracked. It was a hairline fracture in the clay, invisible. Until the morning, Martha noticed the floor of the glass room was no longer warm. She found the break an hour later, deep in the passage below, a clean split along a firing fault that Crane's original pipe had carried for all those years until years of heating and cooling finally told. Without the pipe, the room would cool. Without the warmth, the tomatoes, the beans, the corn, everything Crane had saved, everything they had grown from his seeds, would not survive a Colorado October. All of it rested on 8 inches of broken clay. Martha sat in the passage for a long time with a lantern and the broken section in her hands. She was not a woman who cried easily, but she sat there a long time. The pipe was Crane's original work, fitted clay sealed with a lime and fiber compound she did not have the exact formula for. She could see where he had built each section, the careful overlapping collars, the way each length nestled into the next. He had made this passage the same way he had made everything else here, with patience and intention, and the belief that it would matter to someone eventually. She thought about Edmund. She thought about what he would have said, which was probably that a broken thing was just an unfinished repair. That had been Edmund's way. Steady and unalarmed. She thought about Rose, who was upstairs right now, not asking her to come up, understanding that Martha needed the space to be low before she could rise. She thought about Aldous Crane, who had written instructions for someone he would never meet, who had sealed seeds for 11 years in the hope that they would find their way to the right hands. He had built this for after himself. She could repair this for after now. She came up from the passage with clay dust on her coat and went to find her ledger. The solution was in the second journal. She found it at 2 a.m. Crane's notation on the pipe compound, written in the margins of a page about heat retention. 1 part white lime, 2 parts river clay, horsehair binding, set wet, and allowed to cure 48 hours before heat application. She read it to Rose at the kitchen table by lamplight. Rose said, "We have all of those things." Martha said, "I know." They looked at each other across the table in the same gray-eyed way. "Tomorrow, eh?" Martha said. They pulled the broken section out by noon. It was a single 18-inch length, cracked clean through at the collar fitting, the fracture running in a neat diagonal that Martha examined with the focus she gave to all structural problems, long enough to understand it completely, no longer than necessary. The pipe had simply reached the end of what it could hold. There was no fault in it. Things reach their limit. That was the nature of things. She mixed the compound that afternoon using Crane's proportions, working the river clay and white lime together with a wooden paddle in a tin basin, adding the horsehair binding in careful handfuls until the mixture reached the right consistency. Thick, smooth, workable. Rose stood beside her and read the journal notes aloud as she mixed, calling out the indicators Crane had written for each stage. The color should deepen. It should hold a groove. It should not crack when pressed. It held a groove. It did not crack. Martha formed the replacement section by hand, packing the mixture into a clay mold she built in an hour from materials in the barn, shaping the collar fittings to Crane's original dimensions. Then, she set it in the passage with both lanterns burning close to keep the passage dry while it cured, and they went upstairs to wait. 48 hours. They used the time. Rose wrote to Hester Pruitt, not a defensive letter, and not an apologetic one. Simply an invitation, plainly worded, to come and see the glass room in full growth before the summer ended. She wrote a second letter on the same day to the Dry Creek Ladies' Auxiliary, signed with both their names, inviting anyone who wished to come and see what the Briar Ridge property had become. Martha read both letters before they went out and did not change a word. She wrote one letter of her own, to Lars Gruber. It was short and direct. It said that they had no intention of competing with his market stall. It said that what they were growing was unlike anything currently sold in Dry Creek, and that they would welcome a conversation about how to bring it to people who might want it. It said, at the end, that there was something remarkable up here on Briar Ridge, and that remarkable things were better shared than competed over. She sealed the envelope and handed it to Rose. Rose read it. "That is good," Rose said. "It is honest," Martha said. "That is why it is good." On the morning of the third day, Martha went down into the passage alone. She ran her hand along the new section, feeling the seam at each collar, testing the surface. Crane's compound had cured hard and close, seated against the existing pipe at both ends, the way a bone knits back together. You could feel the seam, but the structure was sound. She connected the collar fittings, sealed the joints with a thin second application, and sat back on her heels. She stayed in the passage for a moment in the warm silence. Thank you, she thought, to no one she could name. Then she went upstairs and told Rose the pipe was repaired. Rose closed her eyes for a moment, and Martha saw her lips move without sound. Her own kind of thanks, directed at the same general address. By the following Saturday, heat was running through the floor of the glass room again. The tomato plants, which had drooped slightly in the cool days, straightened back toward the light. The beans had not lost a single leaf. The visitors came on the same Saturday. Hester Pruitt arrived first, this time without the assessing look, or rather, with it softened, as if she had decided on the ride up that she was going to let herself be convinced if the thing merited conviction. She brought Wally, who stood in the glass room for a long minute without saying anything, and then said, "It really does feel like July in here." "Even in February," Rose said. Wally looked at her. "Even in February." "Come back in February," Rose said, "and I will show you tomatoes." 3 women from the auxiliary came together in a second wagon, led by a Mrs. Fontaine who was small and sharp-eyed and known in Dry Creek for not being easily impressed. She walked the glass room twice, examined the pipe channel with her toe, pressed her hand into the soil over the warm clay floors, and asked exactly 4 questions, all of them good. At the end, she said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Who else knows how to do this?" "We do," Martha said. Lars Gruber came last, just as the afternoon was lengthening. He came alone and on foot, having apparently tied his horse at the bottom of the track, and walked up, which Martha interpreted as a gesture of modest humility from a man not naturally inclined to it. He was still red-faced and still wore the good hat, but he stood in the doorway of the glass room with an expression Martha could only describe as recalculated. He stayed for an hour. He asked the same question as Mrs. Fontaine, worded differently. "How much can you grow in here?" "More than 2 women need," Rose said. He nodded slowly. "I might know some people," he said, "who could use some unusual vegetables." "I thought you might," Rose said. Martha caught her twin's eye from across the room and held it for a moment, one gray-eyed look that passed between them the way things pass, between people who have known each other from the very beginning, who have stood in the same kitchen, through the same grief, and come out the other side with clay on their hands and something worth tending. She let herself smile. Rose was already smiling. October comes to Briar Ridge cold and clean, the ridge going amber and rust above the tree line. Inside the glass room, the tomatoes are still red. Martha sits at the kitchen table with her ledger open, columns full, numbers that mean something good. Rose is below in the warm chamber, turning seed jars in her hands and humming to herself, the spring murmuring at her feet. On the shelf above the kitchen window, Aldous Crane's 3 journals stand between 2 river stones. The third one is not unfinished anymore. Rose has been adding to it. Careful, small-handed, filling the pages he left empty with the story of what came next.